You see these two diagrams we are looking at, we purposefully put them there. They are going to be useful as we discuss identification, assessment, and measurement of risk under risk management, CSME, corporate strategic management, and ethics. For a quick recap, we had earlier looked at another topic under risk management, because risk management is broad and is unique and important in our career development. We cannot afford but to spend the time we are spending on risk management. Thorough framework had been looked at as a simple but effective method of controlling risk, and we had discussed Terra framework using TARA, which represent different things that we need to do about risk in our business. And we said that T represents transfer of risk, and A represents avoidance of risk, and R represents reduction of risk, while A represents acceptance of risk. Straight to the business of the day. Risk identification. We are going to look at the impact of risk also. Just as you can see, we are not going to take it away from us, and we are going to be discussing it on this virtual board that we are looking at. When we're talking about risk identification, you see that caliber that we are looking at before, this caliber in the hand actually is to measure the risk identified. And you see this probability and impact chart actually is to assess the risk identified. So we pick them one after the other. The next question we ask is, so whose job role is it to identify risk? The ultimate job owner for risk identification, according to corporate governance, actually are the directors. So the board of directors should own risk identification. Having said that, risk identification is for everybody because risk is universal and risk involves everybody in the business and in the organization. So leaving it to one person or a few people may not yield the result expected. So risk identification could be delegated, and also it becomes the job role of every manager. Every manager in each function in each department should be able to identify a risk, and the ultimate responsibility belongs to the board of directors. Having identified a risk, how do we identify a risk? That's another question. How do we identify a risk? Risk or risks are our vulnerabilities in the business, are the uncertainty in the business, are the exposures to unfavorable weather in the business, and we need to always be on the lookout for this. And having identified them is a continuous job, but first of all we need to identify as much as possible from the onset. Having identified all these things, we need to put them in a document and list them in a document we can call risk universal. It's a document for risk profiling. You can call it risk profile too, in which we itemize our risk exposures, vulnerabilities in the business so that we will not miss out on them. This process is called risk mapping too. So we map our risk, we profile them, and we put them in risk universal. That is the generic risk that we have, having enlisted them. So we've identified our risk. We know who should identify a risk, and we know who has the ultimate responsibility to identify it. Then we need to look for their impact. How impactful are they to our organization, and which segment of our organization are they impactful? Also, we need to look out for the probability of occurrence, that they will occur, the frequency of their occurrence. Now we are discussing the impact of risk on stakeholders. And don't forget, stakeholders is a generic word comprising of the shareholders, comprising of the public, employee, employer, government agencies, and name it. So, how impactful, in what way or ways are this risk exposure and our vulnerability impactful to us? Are they of high impact, just as we can see here? Very low, low, medium, high, very high. Those are impacts. And likewise on the probability of occurrence, from very low to low, medium, high, and very high. So we need to know how impactful are they to our organization. Who do they impact? What segment of our business do they impact? Having known the impact of the risk, we will be able to now assess and calibrate them. You see that caliber that we show before, we shown you before. We need to calibrate them. This is like an engineering word. It's what mm, 10 mm, 20 mm, 30 mm, and the like. So we need to calibrate them, assessing the risk for the impact, for the probability of occurrence, and group them. So having grouped them, so we've lumped the impact of risk on stakeholders and assessing now together. And one thing we need to equally mention before we move on to measuring of risk is that for the impact of risk on stakeholders, we need to be able to manage it too, in form of communication and the like. And Mendelow actually is very useful here. Mendelow principle is very useful here. Okay, you can check it out. We've released the video before. Measuring risk. How are we now going to measure our risk? The measurement of risk are in two ways. It could be subjective, it could be objective. So we have objective risk measurements and subjective risk measurements. So what do we mean by objective risk measurements? Objective risk measurements are measurements of risk in which we are able to quantify. We are able to quantify the risk, especially like the chart of probability against impact that we are looking at. We are able to measure them accurately. So I'm trying to look for an example of risk that we can easily measure like that. So this risk comes to mind at this time, just for the purpose of this discussion. Non-availability of staff members is a risk, because if people are not available, work cannot be done to a greater extent. And if work will not get done, then we know the implication on profitability and longevity of the business. So this is an objective measurement in which we know, especially for countries that have HR policy being dictated by the ruling human resources management institute, or maybe Code of Corporate Governance also stipulates the minimum leave days for an employee. So this can be measured accurately. We know that, let's say for example, in a year, somebody will not be available for 20 days. So this is an objective measurement. We know the probability and we know its impact for especially the production side. So this is an example of an objective measurements. And if I may ask a question concerning this, because we've done it before, this example cited now, is it a pure risk or a speculative risk? Let's put it on the comment. So this is the example of objective risk measurements. So the subjective side of risk measurements now are those that we could not measure accurately. Probably information is not available, data is not sufficient for us to do it, or total non-availability of information as regards that aspect of our business. So what should we do? We have to use management judgment to measure it. We have to use our judgment to measure it. An example that comes to mind right away could be natural disaster. Let's say for example, we know that our area of business or business premises and the like is prone to natural disaster or even this pandemic all over the world. Now, at this time of recording, is subjective. The probability that it will occur again, we don't know. Its impact is of high impact actually, but we cannot measure it. So it is we have to use management judgments. The directors, the executives, they need to sit down and use their judgments on how to approach this aspect of risk or nature of risk. So having measured them, both the objective measurement and subjective measurements, we need to begin to prioritize. And once we've been able to assess and measure, we should be able to prioritize. Let's say for example, those that have high impact, if they occur, but they have low probability of occurrence. That is one. Two, we can have those that have high impact if they occur and the frequency of their or probability of their occurrence are equally high. That is another. The third one is we have those that have low probability of occurrence but have low probability of impact too. The fourth, we have high probability that they will occur and high probability that if they occur, they will be impactful to our organization. Mendelow has a way out of this. What should we do? Let's just discuss one aspect of this out of the four so that we can move on. We have high impacts and high probability that they will occur. One of the best strategy we could is, first of all, transfer the risk. Once we've accepted it and we are in the industry, transfer the risk first of all. So we must ensure Tara principle, Tara framework, we must ensure, because it's impactful and we know it's going to occur. So we need to transfer the risk, and we will still own the residual risk. Okay, if it's of low probability is going to occur and it's of low impact, what should we do? Well, we put our eye on it. We continue to take a look at it. We can put it under internal control system, that a manager should own it and be observing it. And you will begin to see that it begins to rise to prominent, that it can occur and it can be impactful. Then we have another strategy concerning risk management aspect of such. So we've given us 2 examples out of 4. Let us move on. Role of the board of director in identifying and assessing risk. We are not going to waste much time on this because we started with this. The ultimate responsibility belongs to the BOD, Board of Directors, concerning risk identification and risk assessment. They must calibrate the risk. They must assess its impact, its frequency of occurrence, its probability of occurrence. Then it can spiral down by way of delegating to the managers to hone, and if possible, we can have a risk manager to manage this aspect of risk for us. That's if the organization is a bit large. So the job role of identifying and assessing belongs to the board of directors, and managers are not exempted also. HALA principle, as low as reasonably practicable principle of risk management, states that we must reduce, and the cost of reducing risk should not be greater than its impact and frequency of occurrence. So that is, it's the cost of managing the risk should make sense too, and we should reduce it as low as practicable, as low as is economical. And that is why when I was discussing, I made mention of residual risk. Having transfer risk, we can still have residual risk, because at that point, those risks, if we are to be spending money on them, they are not reasonably practicable again. So we accept the risk, but we are not, for example, we are not transferring, we are not insuring and the like, because maybe they are so minimal and almost negligible. Their impact is their impacts are very low. So that is ALAP principle. As low as reasonably practicable, we must reduce our risk and measure them against the cost, against their impacts and severity. Objective and subjective risk perception. This is the perception that belongs to us as managers, as business owners, as executives, board of director members. Objectively, like before we said, must be quantifiable, while the subjective risk perception are not quantifiable. That means they are qualitative. So these are qualitative aspects and quantitative aspects of risk perception. That is our outlooks concerning the risk exposures, risk vulnerability, events that will occur that we cannot control and we do not know when they will happen. Related and correlated risk factor. Related and correlated risk factors. As we go into related and correlated risk factor, Bengal Latin GFCA has been bringing you this tutorial and lectures, and from GJ's Associates, where I'd love that you subscribe if you are yet to subscribe. Both the return and the new members here, we would love that you subscribe. By that, you are encouraging us, and also you are ensuring that other people around you could be reached. So please subscribe and click the notification button to all, so that when we upload, you will be receiving timely notification. Related, thank you for doing that. Related and correlated risk factor. When we are talking about risk factor that are related, we are talking about risk factor that presents themselves together. Just like the word relationship, they must know one another. They must marry one another. So those are risks that come together, appear together, present themselves together to us. So our risk exposure to related risk factors could be a bit impactful because they come together. So now we talk about correlation. We remember correlation in statistics is still the same correlation. So when we're talking about correlated risk factor, we are talking about risk factor that interacts with one another. And remember, we'll be talking about positively correlated or negatively correlated. Likewise, as risk factors, they could be positively correlated risk factors, and they could be negatively correlated risk factors. So when we're talking about positively correlated risk factors, it means if one is increasing in its impact and frequency, the other two is increasing. So they go up together, they go down together, so they are positively correlated. Meanwhile, when we're talking about risks or risk factors that are negatively correlated, we are talking about risk relationship in which as one is increasing or in impacts and frequency or frequency of probability, the other is diminishing or decreasing in impact and probability. So we say they are negatively correlated. One important aspect of risk management from the board of directors as we run off is setting the pace concerning the risk appetite of the organization. What risk are we going to tolerate? What risk are we not going to be able to tolerate? What risk are we going to accept? What risk are we going to transfer? What risk are we going to avoid? And while we are transferring, while we are avoiding, while we are accepting them, we must know it's a critical job role of the board of directors, the executives, the managers must be delegated to also. Controlling risk is the next topic we'll be looking at, and we'll be looking at risk monitoring, in which we are going to be discussing the role of risk managers, the role of the risk committees, the role of risk auditing, and performing a risk audit. And under embedding risk, that is inculcating the culture of risk management into every segment of our business, we are going to be looking at the importance of risk awareness throughout the organization. We are going to be looking at embedding risk awareness in the culture of the organization, embedding risk awareness into the systems and procedures of the organization, and the role of risk professionals in which you are becoming, and the need for embedded risk management. Then we'll move on to methods of controlling risk. Under it, we'll be looking at the different approaches to controlling risk. We are going to talk about diversification, risk transfer, risk sharing, risk hedging, risk avoidance, and risk retention. You know, we've never mentioned that. We're going to talk about TARA also, TARA framework for risk management. Then we ran controlling risk off by looking at enterprise risk management, and we are going to be looking at ARM and ISO 31000 on risk management. From James Associates, being Calibrating GFCA has been speaking. James Associates, we are value to life, we are value to your business.